first step of our installation process, we're going to go ahead and mount our lift kit brackets on the front and the rear before we move on to installing the arms. For the first step, we're going to install our front lift brackets. They'll be located on the rearward side of the shock mounts from the OEM. So you'll have your frame, a bracket, a spacer, your frame, and another bracket before capping it off with our lock nut. With our front lift brackets loosely installed, we can move on to installing the rear. This will be your rearmost bracket. It has the gussets welded to it and the Thumper Fab cut out. You'll install it from the back of the bike, placing your bolts through the holes that'll go through your OEM shock holes, followed by a spacer and the bracket on the other side of the frame. With our rearmost bracket installed, we can move on to installing the front bracket for our rear lift kit. It'll have no Thumper Fab cut out, and you'll want to make sure that this jog faces the rear of the vehicle. We'll install it pretty much the same way. Coming through to catch our bolts that we previously installed in the last step before capping it off with a lock nut. With our lift brackets loosely installed, we can move on to installing the control arms. We're going to start with our front lower and install it just the same way you remove the OEM arms, just loosely starting your bolts here before moving on to your lower ball joint. With your arm loosely installed, you can go ahead and install the castle nut and washer from your OEM lower ball joint before moving on to the upper arm. Before installing your upper control arm, you're going to want to make sure that your caliper and brake line routing is towards the front of the vehicle. You'll want this brake line in between the two bushing collars for us to route and zip tie later to our provided brake line clamps. Once the brake line is in position, you move forward with installing the upper control arm, fastening it to the frame with our OEM bolts. For the next step, we're going to fasten our upper ball joint to the knuckle using our OEM castle nut and flat washer. For our next step, we're going to remount the caliper. You'll use your OEM bolts and install it just as it was removed. We can move on to zip tying our brake line to our provided brake line tabs on the underside of the upper control arm. You'll want to fasten them loosely at first and then check the steering to make sure that the brake line isn't in a bind. Once you do full lock, both left and right, you can fully cinch down the brake lines, knowing they'll be secure and out of the way of any rotating components. For the next step, we're going to go ahead and install our shock to the lift bracket as well as to the arm. Up top, where we're connecting to our lift bracket, you'll want to install a washer on both sides of the shock in between our lift brackets. Once you have your shock in position lined up with our shock cradle on the upper control arm, you'll fasten it to the arm using your OEM bolt and lock nut. For the next step, you're going to pull the boot back from the steering rack and install our steering stops onto the worm gear by simply sliding them over. You'll take the steering stop and slide it over the shaft until it clicks into position as shown here. For the last step before reinstalling the tires, you're going to want to go ahead and tighten all your bolts evenly, including your upper shock mounts and the bolts that fasten the lift bracket to the frame before moving on to the rear. For the first step of our installation process on the rear, you're going to want to disconnect the emergency brake cable from the brake caliper. You're going to reroute your brake line cable for the emergency brake out from the spot that it was located from the factory. And you're going to route the cable underneath it to give us more slack to allow for our raked arms. Once you have your brake cable rerouted, you can go ahead and refasten it to your caliper. You'll want to have the jam nut all the way down towards the soldered end, sliding it back through the caliper bracket and reinstalling your jam nut before reattaching the cable to the portion of the caliper that'll actually operate the emergency brake. With your brake cable rerouted, you can move on to installing the control arms, starting with the lower arm. We use the OEM hardware to fasten it in place. We'll go ahead and install the lower control arm into the frame using our OEM hardware. Once you have your bushing collars mounted to the frame, you'll go ahead and mount the knuckle to our new lower control arm using the OEM hardware. Once we have our lower control arm mounted, we can move on to installing our upper control arm in the same manner. You'll slide the bushing collars into the frame before fastening them to the frame using our OEM hardware. With our upper control arm mounted to the frame, we move on to fastening it to our knuckle using the OEM bolt. We'll slide the knuckle up into position before installing our bolt. And capping it off with a lock nut. Before we mount our caliper back to the knuckle, we're going to remove the OEM clips that held it to the factory arms before zip tying the brake cable and brake line to the brake line tabs provided on our upper control arm. With the clamps removed from our brake line, we can go ahead and install our brake caliper using the OEM bolts. With your brake caliper mounted to the knuckle, you can go ahead and zip tie your brake line and your emergency brake cable to the upper control arm using the provided brake line tabs that will be welded on your upper control arm. Once you have the zip tie tight and your cable is laying in position, you'll come back and trim the excess off the zip tie for a clean finished look. For the next step, we're going to reinstall the shock, first mounting it to our lift kit brackets before moving down and fastening it to the arm using our OEM hardware. When mounting the shock to our lift brackets on top, you're going to have a washer on both sides of the shock and using our M12 by 70 millimeter bolt to fasten it all together. Next, we'll fasten our shock to our lower control arm using our OEM hardware. With all your hardware tight, you can go ahead and mount the wheels and lower the vehicle back down to the ground before we move on to adjusting your toe in the front. With your toe set and your wheels straight, you're ready to lower the vehicle down and hit the trails.